Okay, so I hope we don't have any technical issues today like we did last time, that's for sure. Um, all right, now what are we doing today? So we're done with seven last time. Now remember we ran out of time. We're having trouble with these Zooms, so we did not get to watch that last video that I sent you. By the way, did I send out the invitations for this class? Just confirm that. I want to double check. I was worried that I'd forgotten to do it, but I see a lot of you are here. Oh boy. No, no. Okay, it looks like I didn't. All right, God. All right, let me do that right now. It's just been one of those weeks. Let me tell you, nothing has gone right. And all of it is technology related, of course. Everything that's screwed up for me this week had 100% to do with technology. So I'm gonna, do I have it? Yeah, I should have the roster right here. All right, let me just take care of that real fast. How did you guys get in if you don't have an invitation, by the way?
This isn't it the same link every single time?
No, see, that's just the whole thing. That part was never made clear to me. So technology means absolutely nothing to me. So I'm gonna go take care of that right now, just in case the others are waiting, because there's only 8 of you. That's not normal. They must all be sitting there waiting for it.
Also, when you sent out the first email, I just added it to my calendar, so it tells me right before
Does it
class.
really? Oh, see,
Yeah.
I didn't know. I just, I know nothing about it. All right, so let me get the roster going here. You always wondered about that. I mean, but when they just explained this to us, they made it sound like every single meeting has to have its own unique invitation. And I guess that's just not the case. Um, I'm hoping that'll do the trick. Okay. Oh, good. All right, that worked. All right. All right, so I sent it out. I guess anyone who's waiting, there it is. So I guess I just forgot. I mean, like I said, it's been a horrible week for me. Just everything that could possibly go wrong has gone wrong. And so I obviously forgot about it. So, all right, so we'll start out slowly. Also, if you notice, the recording seems to be working right now. Remember last time it just suddenly out of nowhere just stopped and it claimed that it wasn't enough memory or something ridiculous. So I deleted a bunch of files. And so far it's running, but like I said, even under the best of times, I do not trust technology at all. So we'll see how it goes. So in the meantime, let's see. Let's go back and get Moodle open. And let's just get that. I think our best bet is to get the video going. Last week, we were supposed to watch a video about inflation in Venezuela, or last time, we were supposed to watch that video about Venezuela. And of course, the Zoom made that impossible. So I'd like to try that right now. And then we can dive into the new material in chapter 8, which is our discussion about the natural rate of GDP and full employment. Okay. All right. Um, Yeah, I guess that was the problem. I see a lot of people are showing up. Okay, the new people, I apologize. I completely forgot to send you your invitation. Um, but here we are now. You haven't missed anything. We're just getting ready to get started. So anyway, yeah, the one right here, Venezuela. We did mention, or remember, we were looking at all the different countries last time that have enormous amounts of inflation, and Venezuela is one of them. Venezuela is a very sad case because 20 years ago, they were one of the wealthiest countries in the Western Hemisphere. And after 20 years of socialist misrule, they're now one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. And it doesn't look like anything's going to improve anytime soon. So we're going to look at that in a second. So first, what I'm going to do.
Home Chef is our secret.
Yeah, so I'm going to send you the link as usual. And let me just take care of that right now. All right, so check it out. And then now, of course, I'll pause the screen. The reason why I keep pausing the screen when the videos are showing is because if I include them in this recording, there's a potential at least to violate copyright laws. So we have to be a little careful about that. So that's why I always pause it when we watch a video in class. Most of the time it wouldn't be an issue, but very occasionally you run into issues. So we'll do that as usual today. So let me just pause the sharing, and then you can watch it on your screen.
Secret weapon to getting dinner on the table every night. Now, as a mom of two, we have no time for meals.
This video is brought to you by Skillshare. Venezuela is in a terrible economic mess, but that doesn't mean that your finances have to be a disaster too. Skillshare is here to help you learn not just about the economy, but how to better manage your own money too, with classes such as Basics of Economics and Understanding the Stock Market. Premium membership will give you unlimited access to topics that will improve your skills and in the process, your life. The first 1,000 people to sign up by visiting the link in the description will receive 2 months of Skillshare absolutely free. Join Skillshare and start learning today. Now it's time for the topic you came to see. Venezuela's economic crisis has made headlines all over the world for the past few years. Hunger is widespread there. Unable to afford the small amount of food available in supermarkets, many Venezuelans have reported to eating garbage to survive. Even zoo animals in Venezuela are starving, according to a report by the Daily Mail, and people have been breaking into zoos to eat them. A recent survey found that the food crisis has also created an education crisis, as more than 1 million children no longer attend school, mostly due to hunger and a lack of public services. Moises Rendon and Mark L. Schneider of the Center for Strategic and International Studies provide a bleak assessment of Venezuela's current situation, saying the country is suffering an unprecedented man-made humanitarian crisis. They say Venezuela resembles a country at war and note some of its major social problems, including extreme food and medicine shortages, rampant crimes in every city, constant electric blackouts, and looting and repression. When you see and hear these stories, you can't help but wonder what went wrong. How could a country that was once most of the affluent countries in South America reach such a sorry state? One source of the misery in Venezuela is its out-of-control inflation, which we will examine in this episode of the Infographic Show. Venezuelan Hyperinflation Explained. Before we discuss Venezuelan hyperinflation, let's begin with a discussion of what hyperinflation is in general. Simply put, hyperinflation is a very high, rapid, and continuous inflation. In a hyperinflation situation, the prices of goods and services in an economy quickly rise to a level so high that they become difficult to afford for most people. While experts cannot agree what that exact level is, economist Michael K. Salimi states that hyperinflation is generally used to describe episodes when the monthly inflation rate is greater than 50%. He gives an example that at a monthly rate of 50%, an item that cost $1 on January 1st would cost $130 on January 1st of the following year. The hyperinflation in Venezuela is significantly more than the rate cited by Salimi. According to an August 2018 BBC article, prices of goods have been doubling every 26 days on average, and the annual inflation rate reached 83,000% in July. One source reported that a cup of coffee cost 450 bolivars in Venezuela less than 2 years ago. Earlier this year, it cost a shocking 2.5 million bolivars. But wildly high prices are not the only serious effect of hyperinflation. As a Guardian article notes, the problem comes when the supply of paper money in an economy outstrips demand for goods and services, causing the value of the currency to fall. Following in the footsteps of Zimbabwe, Venezuela turned to increasing its money supply because it had no other means to pay its debts, as we shall see later. But ultimately, Venezuela ended up in its current hyperinflation situation due to a combination of several factors. Number 3, high government spending. President Hugo Chavez ran Venezuela from 1999 until his death in 2013. Chavez and his administration implemented social programs called the Bolivarian missions that were supposed to improve living conditions for the poor by redistributing the wealth and reforming the way land was used. There was also an attempt to promote economic democratization through the establishment of worker-owned cooperatives. Data from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, or CEPR, indicates that Chavez achieved a high degree of success with these programs. He was able to reduce unemployment from 14.5% in 1999 to 7.8% in 2011. The poverty rate also dropped from 50% in 1999 to 31.9% in 2011, while extreme poverty dropped from 19.9 to 8.6% in 2011. Unfortunately, this prosperity came at a high financial cost. The social programs were good for the people, but bad for the economy. Chavez spent more money on these social programs than the country could really afford. According to CNBC, public spending accounted for more than 50% of Venezuela's GDP in 2012. He also borrowed money from other countries to keep the programs going. By 2013, Venezuela's foreign debt climbed to a little over $106 billion. According to one source, Chavez had been warned about the growing fiscal deficit as early as 2002, but he didn't pay attention to the warnings. For Chavez, these social programs were a way to win over the people. Maintaining his popularity with the people was important to him because it was a way for him to maintain his power. An article in The Economist states that through the Bolivarian missions and the flood of oil money, he was able to rebuff a referendum in 2004 that would have removed him from office. To make matters worse, Chavez and his administration failed to save money for future economic crises, which quickly emerged due to an event that happened in 2014. Number 2, low oil prices. Venezuela's economy is mainly based on selling only one commodity, oil. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. The World Atlas states that it has 300,878 billion barrels of proven reserves. According to Oil Sands magazine, most of Venezuela's proved oil reserves are located in the Orinoco Petroleum Belt, which is located on the eastern Orinoco River Basin. The Orinoco Belt is approximately 370 miles in length and has an area of about 21,357 square miles. It is estimated that the area contains about 1.2 trillion barrels of oil. Another oil-rich area in the country is the area near Lake Maracaibo, which is actually a brackish tidal bay that is located near the Caribbean Sea. One source estimates that the lake's basin supplies about 2/3 of the total Venezuelan output. With the discovery of oil in Venezuela in the early 1900s, the country relied more and more on it as a revenue source. Today, Venezuela derives over 50% of its GDP from petroleum exports, which represents about 95% of total exports. According to a Forbes article, this meant that when oil prices were high, life was good. For instance, Venezuelans enjoyed a high standard of living when oil prices spiked in the 1960s and 1970s. An online magazine called foreignpolicy.com describes how Venezuela was considered rich in the early 1960s. It produced more than 10% of the world's crude and had a per capita GDP many times bigger than that of its neighbors, Brazil and Colombia, and not far behind that of the United States. Conversely, when oil prices went low, life was bad, and this is what happened to Venezuela starting in 2014. That year, the price of oil dropped sharply from $100 to about $70 a barrel, and the price decline continued to a low of around $33 a barrel in early 2016, according to the American Institute for Economic Research, or AIER. The slump in oil prices sent Venezuela into an economic downward spiral. Lower oil prices brought with it a reduction of Venezuela's foreign reserves, and AIER states that this in turn reduced the government's ability to subsidize basic goods and services for its people. Number 1. Continuing economic mismanagement. The Venezuelan government, now under the control of Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro, dealt with the budget gap the way other countries in a similar situation did in the past when they had no other way to pay their debts: print money. AIER notes that printing money set the wheels in motion for hyperinflation. The budget shortfall was closed by printing money. Hyperinflation took hold, destroying the savings of individuals and making productive business investment nearly impossible. A comment made by a nurse named Margarita Oranos helps you understand what living with hyperinflation is like for the average citizen living in Venezuela. In an interview with The Guardian, she says, "We are millionaires, but we are poor. We can just about eat, but if some health emergency happens, we'll die because the prices of medicines are sky high and rise every day." According to economist Theodore Cangaro, hyperinflation continues under Maduro because he is continuing the disastrous economic policies of the late President Chavez. Earlier this year, Reuters reported that Maduro seemed to be in denial about Venezuela's hyperinflation. In an interview with Reuters, Rodrigo Cabeza, Hugo Chavez's former finance minister, said that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has refused to recognize the country's hyperinflationary problem and has no plan to address it. Now it seems that he's come up with a course of action. President Maduro has decided to play games with the value of Venezuela's dying Bolivar currency in a desperate effort to give the appearance that hyperinflation is disappearing from his country. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, or PI, outlines his current plans for the Bolivar. His proposed monetary reform has 3 pillars. 1, slash 5 zeros from prices. So a product that costs 100,000 bolivars would now cost 1 bolivar, and give the currency a different name, the sovereign bolivar. 2, devalue the currency by 95%. And 3, peg the bolivar to the petro, Venezuela's digital currency backed by oil, introduced in February 2018. He then plans to combine these monetary reforms with yet another round of questionable government interventions. CNBC reports that he will hike the minimum wage by over 3,000%, boost the corporate tax rate, and increase highly subsidized gas prices in coming weeks. Pai and other economic experts are skeptical that these measures will work to reduce hyperinflation because they don't address the underlying problems that are causing the hyperinflation in the first place. Pai argues that there is no substantial fiscal reform in the works, no attempt to build dismantled institutions, and no announced shifts in economic policymaking. Pai even forecasts that Venezuela looks set to beat Zimbabwe, a country that managed to have an annualized inflation rate of 79 billion% in November 2008. The economists interviewed by CNBC also have a dire outlook for Maduro's monetary plan. They think that it will make hyperinflation in Venezuela even worse. Amid this aggressive devaluation and monetary expansions due to salaries and bonuses, we are expecting a much more aggressive stage of hyperinflation, all the more so in a context where the elimination of excessive money printing is not credible. The worst of all worlds, says Venezuelan economist Asdrubal Oliveros of consultancy Econ. A large number of Venezuelans have decided that they no longer want to live in this world where all of the social gains of low poverty and low unemployment, recklessly brought by Hugo Chavez, have been wiped out by incompetent leadership, poor financial planning, and widespread corruption. They are fleeing from Venezuela in droves. According to The Guardian, nearly 2 million people have fled Venezuela's economic and political crisis since 2015. The exodus will continue unless some drastic monetary and political changes are made. How long do you think Venezuela's hyperinflation will last? What do you think needs to be done to fix it? Let us know in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video called "Why You Will Soon Be Eating Crickets and Other Insects." Thanks for watching. And as always, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.
Pretty scary, huh? So this is the
Most
God.
homeowners
Hold
insurance
on, hold on.
providers can give you a quote online. But you know
Boy,
what?
that just doesn't want to quit, does it? Yeah, it's pretty scary. But I mean, this is what almost invariably happens when any country is tempted to turn on those printing presses and just let it go.
They can't give you online.
For Christ's sake.
That's right.
Man, that just doesn't want to stop, those ads. All right.
Whatever I want. It's my last day. Nah, you can't do that.
All right. Anyway, So now we're ready for chapter 8. So yes, so like anytime you look at any episodes of hyperinflation throughout history, you're going to discover that it did not turn out well for anyone. Let's put it that way. I mean, it's just a very ugly situation, and it feeds on itself. And before you know it, everybody is impoverished. And then sooner or later, what has to happen is the currency has to be abandoned and replaced with something different. Now, sometimes that works out well. Like Germany after World War II was able to do that. Brazil had a very serious run with hyperinflation in the 90s, but they were able to reform their currency, and they haven't really had a problem with it since then. But there's other countries where this is just an ongoing thing. And it's because they don't really seem to be able or willing to do what it takes to reform the economy. In other words, they have policies in place that make it, let's just say, people have not much incentive to produce anything. And so instead, they start to become too dependent on the government. And so this is what ends up happening, because then the politicians feel the need to buy their votes with spending more and more money that they just don't have. So poor Venezuela, until they get rid of the current leadership, they're probably just going to keep going down the same terrible path. But all right, anyway, so in the meantime, now we're ready for chapter 8, which is a little bit different. And it has its own series of videos too. We'll get to those pretty soon, but we want to start by introducing, oh my God, hold on. Notice how sometimes these ads take it on themselves to pop into your screen, whether you want them or not. So yes, let's get chapter 8 going here. And this is, like I said, is about the natural level of GDP. And so hold on. Here we go. Potential GDP and the natural unemployment rate. Okay, very good. Now, this one, this chapter also has several videos that we can watch. But what's interesting is that this time, for the first time, we're really going to spend some of the chapter analyzing different ways of looking at economic theory. In other words, there are always different schools of thought, and many of them disagree with each other about how the economy actually works. And so we're going to get a taste of how these different schools of economic thought are different from each other, and what they all, or how they explain the way the economy works, and what kind of policy prescriptions they all have. It's pretty interesting, and because of course with the economy, you know, it's very difficult to always know exactly why certain events take place. It's not that we can run experiments and try to figure out what causes what to happen. We just have to observe what happens in the real world and try to make sense out of it. And so economic theories are designed to do exactly that. They take a lot of real world data, they observe what happens in the real world, and they try to create theories that explain how and why all of these events are taking place. So we'll be looking at that today. So, but first, the three schools that we want to quickly analyze are the classical macroeconomics, Keynesian macroeconomics, and monetarist macroeconomics. There's actually one or two more videos that we'll be looking at as well, besides these three. But what we want to note here is that the classicals are the ones who came first. Okay, now remember, macroeconomics and economics is, as a discipline, has really only been around for about 250 years, maybe. We've talked about Adam Smith's excellent book, The Wealth of Nations, a few times. And so when Smith was writing that book, there really was no such field as economics. He more or less created it himself. He himself was a professor at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, and his title was Professor of Moral Philosophy. I'm not quite sure what that means, moral philosophy, but at the time there was no discipline referred to as economics. But when Smith wrote his book, it became clear that this actually was a separate discipline from the other areas, such as philosophy and history. And I don't know exactly when writers started referring to it as economics, but up until about the early 20th century, there was no distinction made between macro and microeconomics. It was all just economics. But in the early 20th century, especially as the Depression started to unfold, a lot of the writing at that time focused on what to do about the Depression. And that was focused more on government spending, on the role of the government in the economy, and in other words, it was focused on big picture areas, which we now know as macroeconomics, whereas previously economics was more micro based, more based on the behavior of individual consumers, the behavior of individual firms. So somewhere along the way, it started to become common practice to break up these two parts of economics into micro and macroeconomics. Now, I'm not sure if anybody really knows exactly when this really got rolling. Let me just see if I can find something on the internet. Number one, when was the field of economics first considered to be a separate discipline? See what they have about this. Well, we know that the effective birth of economics as a separate discipline may be traced to 1776, when the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith published his book. It's a very long title. The actual title is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, but we all just call it The Wealth of Nations, of course. But I really wanted to know when people started actually calling it economics. Yeah, all right. Well, maybe it probably nobody knows for sure, but what he was writing about came to eventually be known as classical economics. Okay, so when we hear the words classical economics, classical micro, classical macro, what they're talking about is basically what Smith wrote in his book. And that was the prevailing wisdom for quite a long time. As a matter of fact, it was accepted that what he wrote was absolutely correct. It was only later on that economists started making their own changes to what he wrote about. And, to a certain degree, as, economies evolved over time, what Smith was writing at the time was probably very accurate. But as, time elapsed and circumstances changed, it's possible that some of what he wrote was becoming less and less relevant. And so that's why new theorists came along and started adding their own twist on what Adam Smith was writing about. So what we refer to as classical economics is really what Adam Smith was describing. All right, now then let's see if we can find out when was it common practice to refer to economics as microeconomics and macroeconomics. I think we're looking at the early 20th century here. Although it's possible. Okay. See, they're telling us the difference between the two, but I was hoping to find out at what point in history. Oh, here we go. It was not always this way. In fact, from the late 18th century, meaning the time of Adam Smith until the Great Depression, economics was economics, the study of how human societies organized the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. The early economists were Adam Smith, credited with being the father of economics, although certainly it's not the case that nobody had ever written about economics before. It's just that nobody sat down and wrote a comprehensive book about it before. Prior to that, there might have been a few articles here and there which were really economics, but this was the first time anybody tried to organize it all together and explain economics from start to finish, like Adam Smith did. In particular, David Hume, who was really a philosopher, did write some important papers about what we now know as economics. But economic theory developed considerably, though, between the appearance of Smith's Wealth of Nations and the Great Depression. But still, there was no separation into micro and macro. Economists basically assumed that either markets were in equilibrium or that they would quickly adjust to equilibrium. Okay, and that's one of the most important assumptions about classical economics, by the way, that even if markets are not in equilibrium, they will quickly return to equilibrium. The Depression is when we saw for the first time that that might not actually be true. There were so many horrible things going on at the same time that the Depression dragged on for more than a decade. Okay, so in other words, the rebound to normality didn't happen very quickly. And so this is when economists started focusing more on unemployment and inflation, which are really macro topics. And most of that came from John Maynard Keynes, who we saw listed here. Keynesian is named after John Maynard Keynes, who wrote several very path-breaking books during the Depression about what to do really about the Depression. He was trying to explain what should we do differently that we haven't been doing in order to get out of this nasty depression. So he's often considered to be the first macroeconomic writer because his focus was more on topics like inflation and unemployment and budget deficits, whereas the previous economists, like I said, were focused more on individual decision-making units like individual consumers and businesses. So, all right, so pretty much this is what I thought. So basically, Smith was considered to be the first economist, and his views prevailed until basically the early 20th century. And then because of the Depression, we have the rise of the Keynesian economics. And these are really the first macroeconomists. Okay. And in fact, if you read Smith's book enough, you'll see that almost all of it is based on microeconomics, or what we now think of as microeconomics, because he was trying to analyze the behavior of individuals. What causes countries, for example, to want to trade with each other? Or why do businesses set their prices the way they do? Or why do consumers react the way they do to changes in prices? So what he was focusing on more than anything could be considered now microeconomics, whereas Keynes was the one who was really the first to start focusing on macroeconomics. So now to this day, we have the two separate fields. And of course, each field keeps getting bigger and bigger and more complicated. It's almost like they're two separate countries, they're kind of related to each other, but yet they're really two separate disciplines now. Theoretically, they tie together with each other, but most economists focus on one or the other. It's very rare to find somebody who does both, because they're becoming so much more specialized. But anyway, so this is a good article, actually. I'm glad that I found it. In fact, you know what I'm going to do? Let me save this. In fact, I'm going to send it to you by chat if you want to read some more. Okay, just in the off chance that this excites you enough that you might want to read more about how economic thought has developed over time. Actually, let me send it to myself. I don't want to lose that. I really like that article. It's a very nice, concise overview of the history of economic thought and how it developed over time, but without being terribly complicated. Or in other words, it's well written, and it covers the important details without getting too bogged down in technical details. All right, that's good. It's always good to understand when you start studying a discipline of any kind, it often is very helpful to gain insights from the way that discipline developed over time, because the discipline develops by people bringing new insights to the discipline and helping us understand even further how the economy actually works. Oh my God, look at this picture. I didn't even notice that. What is that? Is that a real car? Oh, you can't even see it. Look at that. Well, I guess he won't have any trouble getting out of that spot. This must be in Europe somewhere. There's no way an American company would make a car like that. It's basically a golf cart. I mean, really. All right. Well, anyway, enough of that. Let's get back to the notes. So anyway, so this will hopefully help you understand when we watch the videos about the different schools of thought. You'll see how their focus is very different. What they assume about individuals and how they behave, the way they assume markets react to different changes. And of course, all of those give different implications for what we should do to keep the economy as strong as possible. So the classical macroeconomists we think of them as free market economists. In other words, as far as they're concerned, markets will correct themselves. The government should basically leave them alone. All right, the government, it can only make things worse. So it should step back, let the markets take care of themselves. Now, like I was saying before, at this point in time, if unemployment started rising, what might happen is people's wages might start to drop. And so the bad thing about that is you're getting paid less to do the same work. But the good thing is that the company that you're working for doesn't actually lay people off. In other words, wages drop to the point where the company can continue to survive without having to get rid of anyone. Whereas now, the way labor markets work, it usually doesn't work that way. Normally, what happens is if a company is running into trouble, rather than lowering people's wages and keeping them all there, they just get rid of some of the people altogether. And so the fact that this is happening is going to make it more difficult for classical theory to work properly, because they're assuming that if something goes wrong, that wages will drop until we're in equilibrium again. And so there will be no need for unemployment to rise. So that's one of the fundamental theories that they're basing this on, that labor markets are completely flexible and that they respond just like any other market to rises and falls in the cost of hiring labor. So if that's really true, then the government really does need to stay away, because they can't be more efficient than markets. And so, but unfortunately, labor markets are not very flexible at all, or at least not compared to other types of markets. And although the US does have very flexible labor markets compared to most countries, in a lot of countries, it's next to impossible to fire people, like France in particular. And so what that means is that companies are very reluctant to hire new people because, in fact, I think that was this class, we saw that video where in a country like France, hiring somebody is like going on a blind date with the understanding that you must get married when it's over, because you're stuck with this person maybe forever. So US labor markets are relatively efficient compared to the rest of the world, but they're still not nearly as efficient as the market for individual goods, in the sense that wages do not drop when the economy is sluggish. And so, unfortunately, instead, what ends up happening is that when the economy isn't doing well, a lot of people end up losing their jobs. So, anyway, the Keynesian approach is a big picture approach. This is really the opposite of free market economics. Keynes thought the government should be continuously intervening in the markets, and, for example, hiring people that are out of work, providing subsidies to businesses for hiring people, spending more money, raising taxes, spending money. In other words, the big activist government is what he believed in, because he thought, well, if the economy slows down, the government can just step right in and start sending people unemployment checks. They can hire people themselves. But here's the interesting part. Keynes also recognized that if this kept going, eventually this would trigger a lot of inflation. So he said that once the economy gets back on its feet, the government should step back and reduce all of the spending that they've been doing, lower taxes back to their normal levels, and then let the economy take care of itself until at least it runs into another issue. But unfortunately, the practitioners of Keynesian economics didn't see it this way. And so whenever the economy was the least bit sluggish, they would feel free to spend more and more money. And by the time it got to be the late 70s, we had both very high unemployment and very high inflation, which Keynes said that couldn't happen. His approach was, this is only meant to be a temporary fix. When the economy is, strong again, we can stop all this government spending. But the politicians didn't carry it out that way. They just kept spending and spending and spending, and raising taxes. And eventually in the 70s, it got to the point where we had the worst possible combination of high unemployment and high inflation. And so that's when Keynesian policies stopped becoming quite so popular. There's a radical change in a different direction, as we'll see in some of these videos, back towards more free market economics, where the government was basically going to do as little as possible and let the economy take care of itself. And the net effect of that was that inflation dropped from, let's say, over 13% in the late 70s to about 2% in the early 80s. And until recently, it had been there ever since. So, you know, we had a few major intellectual revolutions in economics in the last couple of hundred years. So remember, Adam Smith was rebelling against mercantilism. And so Keynes is essentially rebelling against Adam Smith. And then in the 80s, the monetarists and the other free market schools were rebelling against Keynesian economics. And since then, we've had kind of a mixture of both. Um, you know, the government never really completely got rid of Keynesianism, but it's, you know, not to the point where they're just constantly spending on everything in sight, no matter what's going on in the economy. There's an understanding that inflation is something that needs to be kept under control, because as we saw what can happen in Venezuela, if inflation ever gets out of hand, it can be devastating to the entire economy. Now, the monetarists, their outlook is actually very interesting. It's a little bit different. They're definitely free market economists, but as far as they're concerned, the more important type of policy that the government can carry out is to make sure that the money supply grows at a steady rate, not too fast, which triggers inflation, and not too slow, which triggers unemployment. As far as they're concerned, business cycles are driven by fluctuations in the money supply. And so if the Federal Reserve System could just make sure that it conducts monetary policy properly, there wouldn't be any real need for the government to jump in and cut taxes or raise taxes or do whatever, that the Fed should be really in charge. And by keeping money supply growth at the proper level, they could keep the economy on an even footing and make sure that it grows without growing too fast or too slow. So they were really their influence was very powerful in the 80s. And in fact, one of their leaders, Milton Friedman, who you'll see in the videos, did eventually win the Nobel Prize. Okay, so he was taking that seriously. He was a very powerful force behind this. And so anyway, so but then we've got other schools as well that we want to look at, but that's what we're going to see in our videos. But before we do that, we want to introduce this concept of potential GDP, which we've kind of already talked about. This is where we would be if there's no resources being wasted. In other words, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship are used as efficiently as possible. Or we can think of this as being at full employment, where we've already seen this means there's no cyclical unemployment. So the potential is where we would be if we had no cyclical unemployment. I guess it's kind of like as an individual, there's some potential income you could reach. I suppose, of course, as an individual, you might be able to work more hours and earn more money. But if you overdo it, you risk burning yourself out. So there's probably some optimal mix between working and relaxing, which would generate, I guess you could think of it as, for an individual, their potential income, which balances the need between work and recreation. And so something like that is happening here. We're trying to make sure that nothing goes to waste, and there's some level we could reach. And by the way, at this point, there should be no increase in inflation or unemployment. In other words, the economy is perfectly stable. We're reaching the maximum output that we can produce without triggering more inflation or running up more unemployment. So this is ideally where we want to be. Now, so we assume that all the factors of production in our analysis that follows are fixed. And we're going to assume, and this is constant throughout economics, we're going to often assume that these three resources take a long time to accumulate, whereas labor can be changed very quickly and easily. So imagine yourself, for example, you own a McDonald's, and you realize that your store is crowded a lot. You'd like to be able to generate more income by selling more burgers. The problem is you don't have enough land to expand the size of your store. You may not have enough money to do that either. One thing you can do in the short run is, if you find that the store is always busy, you can hire more workers. That's quick and easy. But to expand the size of your building, that could be a very costly process. And then if you're going to make the store bigger, you have to acquire more equipment that you can cook with. That would be your capital. And again, that's going to be very costly and time consuming. So it doesn't happen overnight, but you can hire new workers. If you find that, let's say, the lines in your store are very long, well, that means there's not enough people working here. And that's easy to fix. So we're going to assume that in the short run, we can hire or fire labor, but it takes a lot longer to acquire more land or capital or even entrepreneurship. Okay, people don't just come out of the woodwork and say, let me run this business. So these are going to take longer periods of time to replace or acquire. Labor can be replaced or hired or fired very quickly. So, but as that happens, GDP changes as well. So we're going to create a mathematical relationship, which basically is designed to show us how much output we can produce with different quantities of labor, holding everything else constant. Now, this relationship is often illustrated with a graph, a special kind of graph, which we'll see in a minute. But mathematically, it can be expressed as what we will call a production function, which simply means if you plug into this function the amount of labor that you're using, it will tell you how much output you can produce. All right, now here we go. We've got a production function for a small firm. Let's say this is a small company that's making a special type of soda that you can't buy anywhere else. Okay, it's very popular, but it's a very small company and they can only make so much of it. So they have a small bottling plant and the equipment is fixed. They can't get more equipment, at least not in the short run, because that would mean expanding the size of the building. The building itself is sitting on a plot of land. It can't really be expanded unless they buy more land. So in the short run, they're stuck with what they've got, except for the labor. That they can change. And so if you look at this carefully, you'll see that in the left column, we have the quantity of labor. Everything from 0 to 6. Let's say that there's not enough room for more workers than 6 in this tiny little factory. On the right, we have the corresponding number of gallons of soda that we can produce with all these different amounts of labor. So let's take a quick look at this for a second. If you notice, we can't have any soda unless we have employees, can we? No, we don't have any robots just yet. Let's just say that that's down the road. Here we need actual human beings to produce the soda. Even if everything's done with machines, somebody's got to turn on the machines. Somebody's got to fill the ingredients into the machines. So no matter how much we have with machinery, how many machines we have, somebody's got to turn them on. Somebody's got to run them. Somebody's got to, there's all kinds of tasks that have to be done to produce soda. So once we hire that first worker, suddenly we have 3 gallons a day. But the person is all by himself in this not gigantic, but this factory. And here's the problem. This person has to do everything himself, everything, which means he's going to be running around all day. And that's going to be very wasteful. In other words, he picks up the phone and talks to customers. Then he's got to run in the back and he's got to fill up the machines, and then he's got to run up to the front and put labels on the bottles, and all these different tasks that might need to be done in a soda factory are being done by this one person who's running around ragged all day. And so, yes, he's making 3 gallons of soda, but he probably could use some help. So along comes the second person, and look what happens to the output. It doesn't go from 3 to 6, it goes from 3 to 8. Why does it go up so fast? Well, think about this. Now, all of a sudden, each worker can take the time to focus on 1 or 2 things that they do very well. In other words, instead of the one person running around and trying to do everything, suppose this person is not particularly skilled at dealing with customers. Well, the second employee can take care of that and just do that only, or else do 1 or 2 things that he does very well. So all of a sudden we have something going on here, which is, I'm going to pencil this in here, called specialization and division. This is what we're witnessing here of labor. Okay, so these two workers each focuses on the tasks that they're very good at, and the other, this way there's no time wasted jumping back and forth from one task to the next. Now, Adam Smith spent a great deal of time talking about this. He explained in his book, actually, what he did was, somewhere in Scotland, he visited a factory that was making pins. And he said, the pin seems like a very insignificant item. And yet it seems to be a lot more complicated to manufacture than we might imagine. Now, this is the 18th century. Everything's being done by hand, more or less. So what he thought he would see when he walked in the door was that each employee is making a complete pin. And they're standing next to each other, and each one is making his or her own pins. But what he noticed is that it was actually not the case at all. Each person was doing one part of the production process to make the pin. Okay. And that's all they did all day long. So let's say there are 8 components to making a pin. Somebody's got to cut the wire, for example, that it's made out of, and somebody's got to put the heads on. There's all kinds of steps involved. And so instead of each person making their own pins, instead each is making one part of a pin. And so, in other words, they specialize in something and they get very good at it. And so before you know it, the output of the factory is growing like crazy. And so he mentioned this in his book. And later on, we saw this in the early 20th century when Henry Ford started producing cars. When he came along, cars were terribly expensive to build. And in fact, each one was custom made for the customer. In other words, you go to the dealer and say, listen, I want this, this, and this. And they would make one just for you. And so what would happen is one craftsman would just make the whole thing from start to finish. So what Henry Ford did was what Adam Smith recommended. He said, no, this is insanity. No wonder they're so expensive. Here's what we'll do instead. We'll create assembly lines, and each person does one thing. One person, for example, puts the tires on the car. Another person puts on the headlights, and another person does this, and another person does that. And that's what they do all day long. And they all get very good at their jobs. And before you know it, we can crank out a lot more cars than we could before. And so because of that, the cost of a car under Henry Ford fell so much that all of a sudden middle-class people could afford to buy a car. And so it was a direct result of what we will now call specialization and division of labor. Now, keep in mind, though, here in this example, we're assuming that we have one factory and only labor can be changed. Henry Ford had the ability to buy as much capital as he needed to get his factories running. So that would be considered the long run. Here, this is the short run, where all we have the ability to do is increase our labor. In other words, if we needed more machines, that is a long-term process. We can't do that in the short run. We have to use what we have. So the results of this, what we're seeing here, are a little bit different than Henry Ford, because he was operating over a time frame in which he could build the factories as big as he wanted to and buy as much equipment as he needed. Here, it's a little different because we're only looking at a very short frame of time when only labor can be changed. So we're going to get some interesting results out of this, though. Now, if you see here, when the third person comes along, the output jumps up again, but only by 4 this time. Okay, now why is that happening? Because we're getting less and less benefit from specialization, because now some of the jobs are overlapping, and possibly there's only so many machines in this factory. And so sometimes people have to stand around and wait for each other to finish with the machines before they can do their own jobs. And so already we're running into the limitations of the equipment and the space in this factory. So when the fourth person comes along, for that reason, the output only goes up by 2. And again, most likely what's happening is that they're not hiring inefficient workers. They're just saying, well, all these people, they've only got so much space to work. They've only got so much equipment. So there's a lot of waste now, which reduces their efficiency. And then it gets to the point where the 5th person adds nothing. And again, it's through no fault of their own, but because there isn't enough equipment or room or, to do their jobs. And then the 6th person actually makes things worse. And because now they're basically getting in each other's ways and they just can't work as efficiently. So we go through these cycles. At first, the output grows fairly quickly, then it accelerates, and then it slows down, and then eventually it becomes negative. So if I were to plot this out on a graph, you'll see what I mean. It's very interesting to look at it and see how it ties in with these different numbers. So here we go. This is the production function, but it is illustrated by what we call a total product of labor curve. All right. So in other words, this chart is the production function, but the graph is called the total product of labor curve. Okay. Well, here it is. Now, it's hard to tell with this graph. It's not the best, but what we're trying to illustrate here is that output grows, let's say, by +3, and then it grows by +5. So in other words, this region of the curve is steeper than this part, because output is growing more quickly. But then it starts to slow down again. Here we're only going up by 4. And then here we're only going up by 2. And here we're not changing at all. And then all of a sudden we're actually going down. So this is typical experience for a situation where only one input is variable. In other words, labor. At first, we gain a lot from the specialization, but then that starts to turn around because of the lack of space and equipment. If we could continue to expand the size of the factory, that would be a completely different matter altogether. We might find that as we keep hiring more workers and expanding the size of the company, the output would continue to grow very quickly. And in fact, that's what happened to Henry Ford. But here in the short run, when we're only able to change the labor, we are seeing that the output can only grow so fast, and then it starts to slow down due to the lack of facilities. Now, what we're seeing here illustrates one of the more important concepts in economics, and it's called the law of diminishing returns, which means that each extra unit of labor, each worker, at first provides progressively higher output, additional output, I mean, and then as we start hiring more workers, the extra output slows. It eventually reaches 0, and then it starts to actually become negative. And again, it's because only one variable is one resource is variable. The rest are fixed. Now, why does this matter? Because it shows us that in order to make more and more soda, the cost will go up. Okay, in other words, each worker is getting paid the same. So in other words, if I'm hiring all these workers, let's say each person gets paid $100 a day. So after one person, I pay $100 to get 3 more units of soda. Then I need to pay $100 to get 5 more, fine. Then $100 more to get 4 more units. You can see what's happening here. I keep paying the same amount of extra money for 1 more worker, but the extra soda that I get is shrinking. So that means the cost of making the soda is going up as I make more of it. And guess what? That's the reason why the supply curve is upward sloping, because it costs more and more to make the soda as I try to make more and more of it. So that's why this is so important. And now I would never go past this point. In fact, I would never go past this point. It would be foolish of me to hire more than 4 workers because I'm getting no extra output here and I'm losing output here. So how many workers I hire will ultimately depend on how much I can sell the soda for compared to the cost of hiring these workers. But I do know that I won't go past this point. There's no point. I mean, unless this 5th person is working for free, I'm not going to hire him or her. And certainly not the 6th worker. All right. So this is an important idea. And this is, well, you'll see where this is leading, but oh God, it's after 11:30. All right. So I tell you what, let's start looking at some of these videos that I promised you about economic thought. And we're going to start with the monetarists. It just so happens they came up first. All right. It was just a coincidence that we'll look at the monetarists and we'll see what they were all about. And then when that's done, we should have time for at least one more of these, the Keynesians. Now, I didn't mention the Austrians. The Austrians were busy. Their heyday was the 1930s and 40s. And one of them did win the Nobel Prize in economics. These were the ultimate free market economists. As far as these people were concerned, government should never just get anywhere involved in the economy. But their focus was a little different. They were trying to explain economics in terms of how information is passed from consumers to the market through their behavior, how information comes back to the producers through market prices. So they were focused on how information is transmitted through the economy through prices, and how the government can, when it jumps in and intervenes, it's simply interfering with that process. But they were very much free market economists, absolutely. So business cycle theory is a very recent development. It's more of a technical look at how business cycles are created. It really, for all practical purposes, is not based on theory at all. It's really an intention. Their intention is to strip out theory altogether and try to explain business cycles in purely technical factors. But we'll see that when we get to it. Let's start with the monetarists, where you'll be introduced to Milton Friedman. All right. Well, remember, he won the Nobel Prize. Hold on one second. In 1976. So he knows what he's talking about. By the way, by some miracle, it appears that the recording is still going on. So this is good. Let's keep our fingers crossed. All right, there it is. So why don't we check this out? I think you'll find it to be extremely interesting.
Monetarism is another framework for thinking about business cycles. Nobel laureate Milton Friedman of the University of Chicago, he was the most famous proponent of monetarism. And as the name suggests, monetarism emphasizes the importance of the money supply, and it emphasizes the decisions central banks make about what to do with the money supply. Now, monetarism is based on something called the quantity theory of money. That means in the long run, the absolute amount of money in an economy doesn't matter, doesn't influence real output or real employment. But in the short run, changes in the rate of inflation can matter. So there are two potential dangers in monetarism: too much inflation and too little inflation. Let's think first about too much inflation, because this is a big part of how monetarism became more popular. In the 1970s, in America, rates of inflation were considered to be too high. And monetarism had a way to explain this. It said the Federal Reserve was creating too much new money for the economy, and that means prices will be rising, and inflation tends to distort the allocation of economic resources. Individuals cannot tell which prices are going up because of the inflation and which prices are going up because something is more or less valuable. And that what we should do is lower the rate of inflation and bring about more economic stability. So at the time, a lot of Keynesian economists were accepting this higher rate of inflation. But monetarism was saying that yes, at first, more inflation is going to get you higher economic output, but pretty quickly people figure out that there's inflation going on, and that inflation ceases to be effective in stimulating the economy. On the other side of the ledger, there's the danger that monetary growth will be too low. And that means the rate of price inflation will be too low, or there may be deflation altogether. And in that setting, according to monetarism, aggregate demand will be too low. In this case, monetarist and Keynesian doctrine, they're actually pretty similar. Monetarists, like Keynesians, believe that a lot of nominal wages are sticky. That is, they can't be readjusted or renegotiated all the time. This may be a matter of contract or a matter of law, minimum wages, or maybe just a matter of workplace morale. But when you have sticky wages and that flow of nominal purchasing power, that flow of money through an economy, when it declines, well, wages cannot just fall in tandem, and employers will lay off some workers, and you will get a business cycle downturn.
Okay, here we go.
So for monetarists, there's a kind of Goldilocks rule. It's desired that there be a constant rate of money supply growth. Sometimes that's been given as about 2 to 3%. Not too high, not too low. In general, monetarists believe in constraining the central bank through rules. They don't trust the central bank to have a lot of discretion and to turn on a dime and make a lot of very complicated, precise decisions. Monetarists emphasize that lags are long and variable. The information of policymakers can be unreliable, so they simply want this stable rule, which rules out the two cases of inflation too high and inflation too low. So far, so good. Monetarism has had a huge impact, and because of Milton Friedman and other monetarists, economists now look much, much more at money supplies and central bank policies. But that said, monetarism still has some important problems. First, monetarism is quite an incomplete account of business cycles. A lot of business cycles can be caused by, say, the bursting of bubbles, or problems in credit markets, or negative real shocks, or other factors. And monetarism just doesn't have a lot to say about these cases. Second, monetarism assumes that there's this notion of the money supply as a single well-defined thing. But in fact, empirically, there are many different money supply measures. There are narrow measures, such as currency plus bank reserves held at the Fed. Or you could add in demand deposits, savings deposits, different kind of credit relationships. Which of those is the true real money supply? Which of those should we stabilize? It turns out those different measures of the money supply, they don't always move together so closely. And if we stabilize one of them, well, other measures of the money supply may not be that stable at all. Finally, there's another problem with monetarism. If the central bank really does fix a rate of growth for the money supply, this can make it harder to respond to other kinds of shocks. What if there's a negative real shock, such as an oil price hike? Some economists think the central bank should then be more expansionary. What if interest rates turn volatile? Maybe then again, the central bank should expand credit a bit more. There may be a shock to velocity. The rate at which that money turns over in the economy may change. And at least under simple forms of monetarism, again, the central bank cannot easily adjust for that. It's the case, in fact, there's now an offshoot doctrine of monetarism, sometimes called market monetarism or nominal GDP targeting, that says, yes, we start with monetarism, but we actually want to allow the central bank the ability to respond to those changes in velocity. Now, monetarists, who generally do not trust in discretion, are willing to put up with these shocks. But in the real world, there's a big debate. Many people believe the central bank actually should go beyond the confines of this very limited rule and try to offset some of these other kinds of shocks hitting an economy. So in sum, monetarism is really important, but still it is considered a somewhat incomplete doctrine of business cycles.
You're on your way to mastering economics. Make sure this video sticks by taking a few practice questions. Or if you're ready for more macroeconomics, click for the next video.
All right, so that's their take on monetarism, although we must say that it did work very well in the late 70s when it reduced the inflation rate from 13 plus to 2% in just a couple of years. But yeah, they're basically saying that it does seem to tie the hands of the Fed a lot and prevent them from taking other actions that might be needed, such as when a real crisis erupts and the Fed needs to step in and intervene. You want to think that they have the ability to do that as needed, whereas the monitors might not appreciate that too much. Um, but anyway, so now the next one is the other extreme, let's say, in the sense that although they didn't mention this too much, the monitors, like I said, were very much free market people who really opposed the government jumping in and intervening in the economy, and also spending too much and also taxing too much. Whereas the Keynesians are like, to them, the solution to every problem is typically just more spending. So, but keep in mind that when Keynes was writing, the economy was stuck in the Great Depression. And so his feeling was that this has got to come first. We have to do whatever it takes to get out of this depression. But later when the economy was in a more normal level, what they kept doing was spending until we reached the point in the 70s where suddenly we did have both high inflation and high unemployment. So, but Keynes was long gone by then. It would be interesting to see what he would have had to say about that. But anyway, so let's see what the Keynesians are all about. So let's fire this over there. And let's see what Keynes had to say for himself.
Business cycles and recessions are some of the worst things that can happen to economies. They mean lower output and higher unemployment and more human misery. Now, in macroeconomics, the causes of business cycles, that's a contentious topic, and it involves at least 4 major schools of thought. The Keynesians, the monetarists,
Hey, what's up?
the real business cycle theorists, and finally, the Austrians. And if you disagree on the causes of business cycles, odds are you'll also disagree on the proper remedies. In this series of videos, we're going to dive into each major business cycle theory and then use them all to better understand the Great Recession of 2008. Let's start with the Keynesians. Keynesian economics is named after John Maynard Keynes, a British economist who in 1936 wrote a very famous book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. In Keynesian economics, there's one key idea, and it's called aggregate demand. So this is very different from the doctrine of real business cycle theory, where the key problem is supply. Now, if you understand this idea of aggregate demand, you'll see, as we get to, why Keynesians tend to favor activist monetary and fiscal policy. But first, let's work through aggregate demand just a bit. Let's break it down into its component parts. C plus I plus G plus net exports. That's consumption, plus investment, plus government spending, plus how much we're selling abroad to other countries on net. Those pieces of the puzzle, that's how much flow of expenditure or aggregate demand there is to sustain labor hires in a given period. That is what, in the Keynesian model, keeps people at work. Now, there's a key assumption here. In the Keynesian model, typically, nominal wages are sticky. Think of a wage as just another price. It's the price of labor. In a typical market, if demand falls, then the price falls and the market clears. If that were true in the labor market, a drop in aggregate demand would mean wage cuts, not people losing jobs. But wages are unlike many other prices. They don't always adjust so quickly, hence we say they are sticky. Why is that? Well, there may be a long-term contract, there may be a law such as a minimum wage law, or sometimes it's just worker morale. So how does that work then? Well, if the flow of aggregate demand expenditure into an economy slows down because wages cannot be cut, well then workers have to be laid off. And that will lower the flow of aggregate demand expenditure all the more because there's lower employment, lower production, less being consumed, less being invested. The key example here, it really is the Great Depression in the 1930s. Starting in 1929, a lot of American banks failed. Depositors lost their money. This was before governmental guarantees. The money supply fell by about a third, and the stock market crashed. So there was less consumer spending and less investment. This led to a Great Depression and high levels of unemployment. More recently, the Great Recession of 2008 also had a significant Keynesian element. We're going to cover that in a separate video. Keep in mind, in a typical Keynesian scenario, if consumption and investment are falling, usually government spending is going to end up falling as well, because there's less revenue being produced in the economy, less tax revenue, and unless governments really borrow a lot, well, that's going to hurt government's ability to spend. That will be an additional negative shock to aggregate demand. So graphically, in a simple aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, what does this look like? It's pretty straightforward. Take the aggregate demand curve and shift that back and to the left. And you will see pretty simply that output goes down in this model. Also in this setting, there may be some second order effects. The aggregate supply curve may end up shifting back and to the left as well. For instance, imagine some laid off workers. They end up demoralized or they lose their workplace contacts. In the longer run, those people are probably going to be less productive. What are the potential remedies here? Well, Keynesians tend to favor activist monetary and fiscal policies. Central banks should expand the money supply to help maintain that flow of nominal expenditure. They should lower interest rates and have easy conditions for credit. Keynesians also tend to favor a lot of government deficit spending. That is, governments should spend more, start new public works programs, try to put people to work, and fund those programs by borrowing money, even if the revenue isn't there from the economy right now. Again, the government is doing everything possible to restore that flow of aggregate demand. So, what are some of the problems in Keynesian theory? First, Keynesian economics doesn't always explain why aggregate demand fell in the first place. In this sense, Keynesian economics may rely on some other mechanisms. Furthermore, sometimes what Keynesians call aggregate demand problems, well, yes, they may be aggregate demand problems on the surface, but beneath that, there's some deeper, maybe hidden sectoral problem in the economy, or slow growth or productivity is the actual problem. So there's some deeper malady, and weak aggregate demand is just a kind of symptom. So just jacking up aggregate demand, even if it's a good short-run protection, it may not always be the best way of solving your problem. Second, many economists believe that actually monetary policy usually is enough to stabilize the flow of nominal expenditures.
Really?
If that's the case, Keynesianism, in fact, will evolve into another doctrine called monetarism. We're going to cover that in a separate video. Keynesians also tend to have a lot of faith in government's ability to time and target fiscal policy. But will government spend that money quickly enough? Will government actually succeed in hiring the unemployed workers? Those are all open questions. Another problem, Keynesian economics predicts that you either have high unemployment or high inflation, but not both at the same time. During America's downturn of the late 1970s, there was a kind of stagflation, high inflation and high unemployment together. That wasn't what the Keynesians had predicted. And during those years, a lot of economists actually turned away from Keynesian ways of thinking. There's also the public choice critique of Keynesian economics. The Keynesian recipe is to run higher deficits in recessions, but in good times to have a balanced budget or even a surplus. But a lot of governments don't do that. They like having the deficits all the time. So it could be there's an asymmetry built into the Keynesian system, where over time you get too many deficits and too much debt, and perhaps eventually a fiscal crisis. In sum, Keynesian economics is really important. It's central to the modern understanding of macroeconomics. That said, there are also some significant limitations to Keynesian ways of understanding the world.
You're on your way to mastering economics. Make sure this video sticks by taking a few
All right, so those are the Keynesians. And yeah, you know, he made a lot of good points there that the problem with Keynesianism is that typically it leads to a lot of inflation and may not necessarily reduce unemployment either. So especially if it's practiced, you know, regularly, even when the economy is doing well. The problem is that Keynes would have said that when the economy recovers, the government should actually shrink up its deficits and maybe even raise taxes. But that proved to be politically unpopular. And so the problem with the Keynesianism is that it's hard to implement it in practice because it just gets politicians voted out of office. And so monetarism is different because it's run by the Fed, which is more or less insulated from political pressures. So that makes it a lot easier to carry it out. All right, now we have time for one more. Let's do the Austrians. And they're the ones who they're seriously hardcore free market economists. So let's find out what they have to say. But their moment of influence really was during, let's say, just before World War II, up until maybe into the 50s. You don't hear about them as much as you used to. But all right, let me send this over there. All right, let's find out what they're all about.
The Austrian School of Economics has come up with its own approach to business cycles, and the most important proponents here are Ludwig Mises and Nobel laureate Friedrich Hayek. Now, the Austrian School of Economics more generally, it emphasizes market price signals and how those price signals communicate decentralized information to entrepreneurs. The Austrian theory of the business cycle postulates how central banks might distort those price signals and give rise to a cycle of boom and then bust. So the basic scenario is this. Imagine a central bank, and that central bank sets out and increases the rate of inflation. For the Austrians, this is very often a bad idea. There's new credit put into the system, and that lowers market rates of interest. But the Austrians stress the point that this lower rate of interest and the extra credit, they're not market phenomena. It's due to the results in the plans of the central bank. So imagine at an interest rate of 5%, an entrepreneur might think there's a whole bunch of investment projects and they're not worthwhile if I have to borrow and pay 5%. But if that interest rate falls 3%, 2%, 1%, all of a sudden, a lot of those investments will look more profitable. So more homes will be built, more factories will be built. But the thing is, they're not actually more profitable. They just seem more profitable at first because, according to the Austrians, the market price signal has been distorted. That's the boom part of the business cycle. So imagine a comparison. Let's say the central bank had not done anything, but consumers had saved more. Well, that would lower interest rates. Interest rates would be lower, but there would also be more consumer savings. The difference when the central bank lowers interest rates is you have the lower rate, but not the increase in consumer savings. So the savings of the economy are actually not geared to support this extension of long-term investment goods. Over time, those investments will be what the Austrians call self-reversing. It will be revealed eventually the demand for homes, it's not that high. The demand for what that factory was producing, it's not that high. Maybe consumers instead want to buy ice cream and bananas, other shorter term goods. As those long-term investments turn out to be unprofitable, they are liquidated, workers are laid off, and that is the bust part of the boom-bust business cycle. What are potential examples? Well, many Austrian economists have argued that very early in the 21st century, the Federal Reserve was too easy with credit. This encouraged too many mortgages and too much investment in homes, and that may have been a factor behind the real estate bubble of the 2008 crisis. So you look, for instance, at the economic problems in the Eurozone. After the euro was introduced, many investors thought that lending money to Greece was in effect as riskless as lending money to Germany. There was an implied governmental guarantee from the European Union itself, at least that's how it was perceived. So too many investors lent too much money to Greece, That later turned out to be a malinvestment. Again, this is not exactly the classic Austrian theory, but it's still a case where government intervention sent some of the wrong price signals. So what's the Austrian solution? Well, typically Austrians favor a relatively small role for government because they see markets as working relatively well and governments as distorting market price signals. A lot of Austrians have also argued for relatively tight money, and they don't want the central bank to be trying to stimulate the economy with more credit or lower interest rates. Okay, so how might we graph the Austrian theory in terms of an aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram? This is a little complicated, but here's one way that you could capture at least some of the Austrian element. When the boom comes, think of the aggregate demand curve as shifting out into the right. That's the economic stimulus. At first, output goes up. But those new investments, precisely because they're not well matched to what consumers really want, in the longer term, the economy is poorer. The economy is less productive. So over time, think of the long-term aggregate supply curve as shifting back and toward the left. When you put those two developments together, what you'll see is that in the longer run, output is lower, as you could indicate by this point here, C prime. Once the economy adjusts, you'll have had a wasteful boom and a costly process of correction. And that move back to C prime because of the mismatch of what is produced and what consumers want, well, that's the bust. Okay, so what are some possible problems with the Austrian theory? First, the Austrians don't quite explain why so many smart market entrepreneurs are so tricked by the central bank and the increase in the money supply. Interest rates are lower. Well, so what? A lot of entrepreneurs know that central banks manipulate interest rates all the time. The entrepreneurs might just think, I should wait or I should just make up my own mind. Let's not be fooled this time around. The second problem, in the Austrian theory, why is the downturn, why is the bust so painful? Let's say the economy builds more investment goods, and then it doesn't finish all those projects, it switches back to consumption goods. Why does there have to be so much unemployment? It seems here that the Austrian theory may have to rely on some Keynesian or monetarist mechanisms of sticky wages, sticky prices, falling aggregate demand, or other ideas. Finally, many versions of the Austrian story may imply that consumption and investment, they tend to move in opposite directions. So think back to the Austrian boom. When the boom starts, there's a greater production of investment goods and less money being spent on producing consumer goods. That's the Austrian model. But when we look at the actual data, we find more co-movement. That is, the production of investment goods and consumer goods tends to move together. And that's an outcome not exactly matching the predictions of Austrian theory. So to sum up, I would say this. The Austrian account is not a mainstream account. Probably most economists wouldn't agree with it. There are still many economists who believe in the Austrian theory, and it may in fact explain some features of business cycles, but it still remains to be seen whether it can be a more fundamental explanation.
You're on your way to mastering economics. Make sure this video sticks by taking a few practice questions.
All right. Now, the one thing I forgot to mention here, at the end of some of these, they're talking about aggregate supply and demand. We actually haven't done that yet. So, we'll hang on to that until later on in the course, but it's basically a way of extending supply and demand to the entire economy. In other words, aggregate demand means the demand for all goods and services in the economy, and aggregate supply means the supply of all goods and services in the economy. So it's an extension of the traditional supply and demand curves to the entire economy. So that's really what that's all about. But we'll get back to that later on. But still, you should be able to pick up the important details here without needing those curves. So we'll have to save for next time the real business cycle theory, which is a little different. It's not really tied to one individual like these tend to be, these other theories. But yeah, it's a little more technical, but it's important to understand what they're trying to say because a lot of people take this very seriously. A lot of economists think that real business cycle theory is a better explanation of the business cycle than the ones we've seen here. But in the meantime, I guess we'll stop here now. The recording seems to have just finished itself up properly. Everything's fine. So I guess the problem was I had too much or not enough room in my hard drive. So I've taken care of that. So I'll be able to post the recordings as I always do. And in the meantime, I guess just keep working on your exams and I'll see you all next Tuesday. All right. Any last minute questions? Yes. All
Thank you, Professor.
right. See you later. Oh, Fernando. Yes.
Hi, Professor. I have a quick question. Just to refresh myself, this test for or the midterm exam for
Mhm. Yeah.
is due on what day again? Next week?
I thought I said, was it next Monday? I think I thought I said.
The following Monday.
I'm pretty sure. God, I know I wrote it down somewhere. I made an announcement in one of my classes. Maybe it was this one. No, damn it. I have it written down somewhere, but it's definitely not like today's Friday. I think I remember it being next Monday, but I'd have to double check it. I don't have that information right in front of me, but I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Oh, is it? Do you remember if it's definitely Monday, Emma? I thought I said Monday. If
Well,
it's
which
whatever
Monday,
day it
though?
is, whatever day it is, you can have until midnight. Okay. But I'll tell you what I'll do when I get home. I will post the information as an announcement, which I should have done in the first place. But so I think it's Monday, but I have to double check. And if it is Monday, you'll have until midnight. Okay. That should be enough.
So I just want to make sure you're referring to the Monday that's coming up, right? After this weekend or the next Monday?
No, Monday, whatever next Monday is, that would be the 18th. I'm pretty sure that's what we said, isn't it?
I'm not sure because I got another, I have another midterm from your class and then other stuff. So, I mean, I've been preoccupied about that.
Right. Like I said, you know what you do, send me an email. I'm not at home right
Yeah.
now. Send me an email and I'll double
Alright.
check it and I'll let you know. But I seem to remember it being Monday, but it would definitely be at midnight, whatever day I chose.
All right. I'll let you
Right.
know. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right.
Good day. Good weekend.
All right, you too. Anyone else? Okay.